Hello and welcome to this, the first episode of Plugged In, the Engie News podcast. We're building on the solid foundations of the Montel weekly podcast. We'll be bringing you more headlines. We'll be bringing you more in-depth analysis and insights from across the energy sector. Our reporters will help us set the scene. Our first guest this week is Jonathan Brearley, the CEO of Ofgem. But before I talk to him, here's Lawrence Walker, our Deputy Editor-in-Chief.
I'm stood here on Romney Marsh in Kent, on the south coast of England. Behind me are 26 massive wind turbines, each capable of generating up to 2.3 megawatts of power. They're playing their part in a bigger plan, arguably one of the most ambitious energy plans in Europe. Through the doubling of onshore wind capacity, like this, the tripling of offshore wind, and a myriad of other measures, Britain aims to achieve a clean power system by the end of this decade. But is the country facing an energy squeeze long before then? UK energy giant Centrica recently warned that the lights could go out if we don't invest in gas storage. And while this could be considered alarmist, there's no doubt that a diverse and reliable mix of baseload capacity will be needed to compensate for this growing share of intermittent generation. The government's ambition is, of course, a monumental task, requiring huge investment to the tune of some £40 billion a year. Along with the new generation capacity, more than twice as much transmission network needs to be built by 2030 than over the past decade. Britain also needs to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, which has always provided the bedrock of our energy security. With the closure last year of the Ratcliffe-on-Soar power station, coal in Britain is dead. But for how many more years do we need to burn gas, which is also polluting, while being open to global price and supply volatility? How will the government attract the investment it needs to achieve its targets? And in the meantime, should we take Centrica's warnings of a supply shortfall seriously, or is it simply tilting at windmills, or in this case, wind turbines?
So that was Laurie, Jonathan, and here's Jonathan, CEO of Ofgem. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Now, Laurie was highlighting some of the issues here, and one in particular that's been in the news early in 2025 was the issue of supply security for gas. So is the UK anywhere close to running out of gas?
So, look, we have one of the most secure and resilient systems in the world. And we've just been through a 2-year crisis when there were genuine concerns around the gas market. So I point to what National Gas have already said, which is that, no, we are not close to running out of gas in the system we have right now. Now, remember, we do have storage in this country. We have some storage, but we also rely on a very diverse market to produce what we need. So we are the main importer of LNG, for example, and that's been a big sort of mainstay of the last few years. And of course, we have access to European markets and European grids as well. So you can never say no to any security supply question. I've learned that in my last 20 years, but am I deeply concerned about it? Not right now.
Does the UK need to invest, though, in more storage, gas storage, or is it sufficient?
Well, as Ofgem, we are open to this. The government are having ongoing conversations about storage. But as I say, you don't look at one way of producing the capacity. You look at all the different ways you might be able to get gas into the country. So the decision has to be taken in the round. I mean, what I would say, though, is remember, as we begin to transition to new forms of generation, so carbon capture and storage or hydrogen, well, then new questions come up. So one question will be, if we start getting more hydrogen generating power stations or hydrogen fuel power stations, how do we store that? And how do we make sure we have security of supply in hydrogen? So there's a long-term question, but I think in the short term, you've got to weigh up a whole set of factors.
I mean, I'd love to talk about hydrogen with you as well, Jonathan, because that's certainly a very interesting topic. But, if we stick to, you mentioned LNG, and obviously the UK is very reliant on LNG. So we've basically weaned ourselves off Russian gas. Is there a danger that we're becoming too dependent on another source of gas, which is the US, and a very kind of, not so predictable president in place at the moment? But is there a danger that you swap one dependency for another?
Yeah, look, I should say as a regulator, it's a bit beyond my remit to talk about the President of the United States. But I think you make a good point, and I think we should step back and look at the situation we find ourselves in today. So the vast majority of our energy depends on the gas market. Now, if you go back 5 years, when I started in this job and in my previous job, that was a very stable market, and in fact, quite under-examined, actually, in terms of how it was working and who the main players were, because it had always worked so well. So we had a relatively low, relatively stable price. Now, what's happened in the last few years is geopolitics has firmly inserted itself into our energy system as a whole, but into the gas market. And actually, regardless of where your gas comes from, we do have a market that depends on decisions that are made by other global leaders. So I'm absolutely with the Secretary of State when he says we need to get to a different system. We need to get to a system that is clean power by 2030, not just because environmental enthusiasts like me want us to tackle climate change, but because it's good from a price point of view and a security of supply point of view. So strategically, should we move to a different system? Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that's not even touching on the way it's been criticised in certain parts of Europe about how the wholesale price is formed, with gas playing a major part in that. But I'm not going to touch on that with you here, Jonathan. But I think the clean power by 2030, as Laurie mentioned in the scene setter, and as you've highlighted here, is massively important for security of supply and also for greening the economy and the energy sector.
And for cost, I'd argue. Look, for price, getting stability rather than the volatile markets we're in.
Absolutely. But is it achievable? These are massively ambitious targets. I mean, how ambitious is it? Is it, as Laurie said in the intro, is it tilting it to wind turbines or windmills?
Look, I've been around energy for nearly 20 years now. And the number of times I've heard things that are impossible that turn out to be possible are more than I care to mention. I'll just mention a couple of examples in a moment. So without a doubt, it's a massive task. Building the amount of transmission infrastructure, which we're intimately involved in with the network companies, is a huge task. We have 80 projects altogether that need to be done roughly on time to get to where we need to get to by 2030. We've got a huge amount of generation build that needs to happen, and we've got to redesign our markets so that people can use this power in a very, very different way to when we get there. And by the way, we've got new technologies like long duration storage that we need to both scale up and create the regulatory mechanisms to support them. So without a doubt, it's a really, really big job. But, as I said before, so I remember, for those who don't know, I led electricity market reform and the introduction of contracts for difference, which now the industry love. And indeed, brought a huge reduction in offshore wind prices. Now, two things to say. First of all, people told me at the time that this was too disruptive and this wasn't going to be good for investment, and it drove a huge increase in investment. But I remember in 2013-14 receiving emails from analysts, from equity analysts, telling me they'd surveyed their members and it will be impossible to meet our offshore wind goals by 2020, both on cost and on delivery. Now, what we saw was two things. First of all, we saw the auctions drove a phenomenal reduction in cost. So I remember we were setting up a task force to get offshore wind down to, in 2012 prices, to £100 a megawatt hour by 2020. We introduced the auctions, and within 3 years, it was down to around £55. So all my experience suggests that when you set clear goals, when you work with the industry properly, that you can achieve far more than you imagine you can. And look, I'm optimistic. When I talk to the network companies and I look at how they are gearing up to deliver this, everyone is pointing in a similar direction. And I think the thing that 2030 for me has done more than anything else is it's brought clarity. It's brought clarity around what it is we all need to do. So if you leave the world to economists like me, we'll have 1,000 different options and we'll be spending our entire time trying to optimize between them. But the goals that we have quite a focused to-do list as an industry, and I think Ofgem has quite a focused to-do list itself. That makes a huge difference. And if we can deliver that, I think it's a huge win for British customers. So can I guarantee it? No. Is it impossible? No.
Okay. That's very reassuring, I think. But one of the issues, one of the key obstacles, if you like, is rolling out the transmission grid. But how do you get local populations, local people involved, and to accept that? I mean, the NIMBYism, the local acceptance is very, very hard to get when you have a series of reviews and court cases, etc. That whole permitting process will need to be speeded up, won't it?
Absolutely. And look, I should say one thing. Look, I'm from the countryside. I'm from deep in the heart of the southwest. I know how my neighbours and my friends there would think about big infrastructure going through what is beautiful parts of the country. And I think the first thing I say is that the companies themselves have to get better in the way they engage with communities around the projects that they're developing. So I watch some of the schemes across the country, and there's a real difference between companies that are engaging early, giving clearly defined choices, not pretending things are possible when they're not possible, and genuinely asking community, how can we optimize this for you, accepting there's this big national need out there to make it happen. The second thing is I'm a big fan of community benefits. I think finding ways to give back to communities who are ultimately giving something up is a really good way to try and make sure we can support projects. But equally, I am really pleased to see that we are looking at changes to the planning system itself. I care deeply about diversity. I care deeply about climate change, but we have to make those trade-offs more quickly if we're going to deliver this infrastructure. So with all of those things, absolutely, I think this is possible, but we have to engage well. And that isn't just a policy issue. It's not really a regulatory issue. It's about how companies are working with the people whose lives they are changing.
Absolutely. Is it easier to build that grid infrastructure at sea? I mean, for example, fish don't vote. So is that easier in some ways?
Well, in some ways, from certain perspectives, it is. Clearly, there's a cost element to all of this that we have to keep an eye on. But I've seen projects that have been resisted locally where they're landing in for offshore sites, for example. So I don't think it's a kind of panacea to the sorts of problems that we face. And even, I mean, I used to sort of, at one point, work developing interconnectors. So there are a lot of environmental rules and regulations, rightly, around what you put in the marine environment, because, of course, that's highly sensitive to changes. But it comes back to a more general point that I'd like to make, which is this. You know, I've been CEO for Ofgem for 5 years. I was leading networks roughly another 4 or 5 years before that. And in a sense, there is a phenomenal opportunity for the whole sector, but let's just take the network sector right now. But all investors and the companies that they're investing in need to think hard about two things. You know, what is life like out for customers out there, and how are we all doing our best to make sure we're delivering a service for them? But also, when we think about the communities who are affected, how are we working with them to make sure we understand their perspective, we adapt what we can, and we're working in a way that compensates that for some of the change they're making. So there is a very positive place for the industry in this country, in my view, where businesses can grow, where we see huge expansion and huge build out. But to sustain that and do that properly, do not forget who we all work for and how we need to manage this change across the country. Ofgem can't do it. Frankly, the government can't do it. It's going to take the industry.
Absolutely. And the population at large, isn't it? And their acceptance and their involvement in these projects. And I think, you know, it's also another thing to add with the interconnectors now, obviously, with what's happening in the Baltic. There are serious defence and security considerations as well with any of that cabling, you know. But you've been in place here for 5 years, Jonathan. Yes. What have been the biggest challenges, and what would you say has been your biggest achievement so far?
Well, look, let's start with the challenges, and let's start. You know, my predecessor and I kind of joke about this. When I came into this job, he said to me, you know, things are quite calm now, and don't worry about the retail market. We've had the CMA investigation, and you know, I tease him about this now. Now, clearly, when I came in 2020, the world was very different. I arrived a month before COVID, and so working through the COVID crisis and then the gas crisis, there have been huge events that have changed the course of what I expected this 5 years to be. But I love the fact that Ofgem has been proactive through that, where we've had to learn lessons, we've learnt lessons, and we've done things differently. And we've shaped a market very differently from when we started. So if I go back to some of the highlights, you know, we said to government in 2020, we would like the creation of an independent system operator. It's fantastic now to see NESO set up. And I'm a big fan of the work they've done so far to get us through 2030. I'm a big fan of the institution that we've created. I think that's a step change in the way we're building out this infrastructure. The fact that you and I can talk about a strategic plan for networks, that we can talk about the scale of generation that we need in quite direct terms, is a massive contrast to when we started 5 years ago. Equally, despite all the challenges of the gas crisis, I'm incredibly proud of the work Ofgem did to make sure everyone was kept on supply, everyone was looked after, and everyone kept their energy at the level of the price cap. Even though, to be honest, there were big things we had to learn around how we regulate the retailers and how we perceive risks in the market. So I think a change for me over the last 5 years is, yes, let's make sure we have vibrant markets. Let's make sure those markets are working well. But let's also make sure we are hearing customer concerns. And I come back to this point I made before, which is, you know, it's not just about me. All of us need to keep our ears open to what people on the ground are telling us. Because at the end of the day, public confidence is what sustains this industry. And this is an essential service for those customers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, the energy sector generally in the UK and elsewhere as well, hasn't always been seen in the best light. Yeah, and I mean, how in a sense, and we've seen a lot of failures of suppliers. Obviously, no one saw the energy price crisis coming. But how do you secure these kind of retailers? How do you ensure that their hedging strategies are in place so that they don't go under and that other big suppliers don't take them over? How do you get that in place? How do you have those guarantees in there?
Well, look, I mean, this is a big change in perception from us, actually. So if I go back to 2020, we were quite an economic regulator in the sense we were like, well, retailers run themselves. We don't really need to get involved. If they go bust, then, someone will take the customers. Therefore, it's fine. And to be fair, at the time, the cost of failures was relatively low compared to the size of the industry that's out there. What we learned, and what we had to learn painfully, is that isn't good enough in a market that carries so much public risk. So my argument is not just based on what we saw in the crisis, but it's really based on what should be happening on an ongoing basis. So right now, we've pretty much done what the banking regulations did after the financial crisis. We say two things. So we do monitor retailers' hedging strategies, particularly around the price cap. So if you have customers on the price cap, you need to make sure that you're able to buy energy forward sufficiently so that you're insured against the sort of price rises we're seeing right now. But also we're saying to retailers, you need to hold a certain amount of capital so that if things do spin out of control, you've got reserves to call on when things go wrong. And look, as I said to Parliament in January, we can't guarantee every retailer will still survive. We don't have a market that's as resilient as we would like, but it is on a journey, and that's a journey that is being driven by regulation.
I mean, you can never make it risk-free or 100% resilient. I mean, there's always going to be that's the element of the market.
Well, you need a market that functions in that way. If a company's not performing, there needs to be an orderly exit for that company. We're just much more thoughtful about that. And look, without sort of extending into deeply into retail, the same is true really on the outcomes we want from the companies. So now we're much more clear around how they treat vulnerable customers, how they respond to customer queries, so that we're creating a sense where actually there's a shared vision between the regulator and retailers around where we're heading, a bit like I've described on the network side. And again, there's an incredibly positive place for a retailer in this country. If you can generate services that allow me to move my demand over time, so I'm an EV owner, I'm a static EV owner at the moment, I'm not as flexible as I should be, quite frankly. But if you can persuade people like me and others as they get them to be able to charge their cars when things are cheap, you've got a massive offer for your customers, but you've also got very different markets from the more regulated price cap. So what we want to do in both areas is create this sense of the overlap between business success and customer need. And I think we're making progress on both.
I mean, flexibility is absolutely key here. There's a huge amount of
Yes.
flexibility in the market. As you said, batteries of EVs, if you utilize that fleet. So there are plenty of possibilities out there in terms of ancillary services and the what retailers or suppliers could provide.
Right, and look, we saw it in the crisis where we had the demand flexibility service, accepting that we paid quite a lot for that. We did have a lot of people adjusting their demand even manually. Now imagine a world where that becomes automated, where we use AI sensibly to help customers. I think that's got huge potential. And again, in this world of 2030, where we are going to have millions of electric cars on our roads, we are going to have heat pumps being rolled out. And indeed, we are going to have a system that needs us to be more flexible and adaptable. That's going to become more important.
Especially in the times of, that lovely German word called Dunkelflaute. Exactly. So, which is becoming more into the English vernacular now, isn't it? I think, even seeing it in the mass media. But so how would you compare the supplier market now as compared to when you took over at Ofgem?
So when I took over, we had 70 companies in the domestic supply market. So it was very, very diverse, very fragmented. And looking back, I think we took the perspective that because there were a lot of companies and because there was quite a lot of switching, these were signs of success and these were signs of a market that was working. I think what we have now is a much more concentrated market. So we do have a range of suppliers, but nowhere near that number. And we are beginning to see switching increasing again, but at lower levels. I think what we have now is a much more resilient set of companies. We have companies that I know, because I speak to all of them, that are genuinely thinking strategically about how we get to 2030 and how we get new services implemented. And when I look at some of the ones we lost, there were some very innovative companies there, but there were also companies that were running a bit of a playbook, which was issue low tariffs and hope the market doesn't turn against you. And that we've taken out, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That can only taking some of some of those players out, I think, can only be beneficial for the market as a whole, because when they go under, it does create
cost and
reverberations.
disruption, and that's not what we want to see.
Absolutely. I mean, Laurie, in his intro, and then when he set the scene there, he mentioned Ratcliffe, the Ratcliffe coal-fired station, and that's quite a key moment for the UK, closing off the last coal plant. You know, sad for some, and a vision of hope and for the future for others, I think. But how do you view it in terms of gas? Are we ever going to be likely to wean ourselves completely off gas for in power generation?
So just talk about Radcliffe for a moment, because it was a big moment, actually. I was back in the energy department in government where we talked about coal coming off the system, and it all felt very abstract, and it was all on PowerPoint slides and spreadsheets. And we had long debates about whether we needed things like the emissions performance standard, and anyone remembers that, and Amber Rudd's commitment to take coal off by around this time. But it's a real mixed feeling, I think, for me and for the industry, because coal has provided this country with a backbone of its energy needs for over a century, longer, centuries. So I can understand the mixed feelings, I can understand the emotions behind it. And, you know, there is a positive vision out there. And, you know, we do need to move to different sources, but I don't want to underplay the hard work and the incredible role that industry played in our history and getting us to where we are now. Now, when I look at gas, you know, without a doubt, we will need gas in the future. We're going to need gas to balance the system. We have CCS projects that are going to allow gas to be used in a more carbon efficient way. But we need to be significantly less dependent on gas than we are today. And it all comes back to me, to the experience we've had over the last 2 or 3 years, where we've seen what those volatile markets can do. And in my mind, when I step back and think, well, you know, why is it collectively across Europe, actually, not just Britain, certainly not just Ofgem, did we end up so reliant on a market that was so dependent on frankly, a country that at any time could take a very aggressive stance towards Britain and Europe. And it is because I think we've lost a bit of the geopolitical thinking we used to have. So if I go back to when I started, even in the mid-2000s, but you go back 10, 20 years before that, geopolitics was a big part of your energy discussions. You know, people thought about long-term contracts, they thought about relationships with countries, and we all moved to a place where we relied on markets and market mechanisms, all of which are beneficial, all of which drive really good sort of short-term cost savings for customers. But we are going to need to be a bit more strategic about this, both in terms of the way the gas market shapes up. And as you mentioned, you know, there are other countries that may or may not sort of have a role in the geopolitics around that. We need to make sure we've got diversity while we need gas. But the principal thing is we need to move away from it as far as we can so we get to a more stable place. And look, where I'm optimistic and where I think actually this industry is incredible is in its ability to innovate. So I think about heat pumps now, and you know, we have debates about where heat pumps can be used, how they can be used, and how much they're going to cost. I'm hopeful, not only based on what we have in the technology today, that actually you're going to see technologies like that evolve and improve in the same way solar has, the same way wind has, and the same way all the technologies that are contributing to the low carbon sort of generation that we have.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned earlier the long range or the long scale long-term energy storage. That's going to be absolutely crucial in the energy transition. But you know, does anything keep you awake at night, Jonathan, in terms of what's the energy situation, the market situation that we have at the moment in the UK and more generally?
So look, I mean, the energy market is far more eventful than people like me would have imagined a few years ago. So we have to make sure we are managing risks. As I say, I do think collectively thinking about the geopolitical situation around us is important. And, you know, we have to make sure that we are able to manage things that are unpredictable. You have to, as energy regulator, accept that, particularly through the winter, your job is quite short-term as well as long-term. You have to think about what's happening to people today. And you have to make sure that the system around you is resilient to much wider scenarios than I imagined in 2020. So I don't get kept awake by specific things or particular worries. But I do want us all to think much more broadly about what might undermine the energy system for a British consumer. And I'll tell you one thing. I think we all kind of understand now that security of supply is paramount. Security of supply is what this country relies on. So we have to make sure that any transition, any system has that as one of its bedrocks.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been one of the sort of trilemmas in it, if you like, and sort of competitiveness, security of supply, and also the environmental, you know, the clean side. Yes. So it's always been there, but now it's shunted to the fore, if you like. You know, do you find as a regulator you're being pulled in all directions, from like, you know, fighting for consumers, but also, you know, ensuring government policy and doing what TSOs or the market wants, and there are lots of different diverging interests there. And do you find how do you cope with that?
So look, I mean, that is the life of a regulator. That's the life of a regulator in normal times, let alone in the times we're in, which is you are always sort of trading off the consumer interest against what companies need to be able to deliver against wider government goals and objectives. So that feeling is not new. I mean, even when I came in 2016 into Ofgem and we had to reset the price controls, which in a sense meant at that time reducing returns for investors for networks. That was a tough process, but we handled it in the sense that we gave a lot of warning beforehand. We made sure the investment community understand where we were coming from, and we made sure that we'd done enough work to land a big change like that for them, because we felt this thing wasn't balanced in favor of consumers. Now, you're always going to spend time having to weigh different things up. It's why we have regulators. What I'd say is different is the scale of those have changed and the involvement with government is closer. So we're an independent regulator. When it comes to the cost of capital, we'll be in a darkened room with a towel around our head and we'll make our decision on our own. But when the government is laying out a plan for infrastructure, when the government is basically providing the incentives for generation to be built, we need to work closely with them, understand their vision, and make sure together we're providing a coherent sort of whole to what we're doing.
I mean, the key element here you meant was providing that incentive to get investment into energy infrastructure and generation in GB. How do you do that? I mean, it's in a way it's easier said than done.
Well, there's kind of two things in my mind. One is the technical work. So I've got teams here who are running lots of financial models, like the famous CAPM model, for those who know what that is, around how you begin to set the limits around this. But the other is the relationship. And, the thing I feel like I've really learned in the last 5 years, which I may have known a bit in 2020, but certainly not as much as now, is actually it's the relationship you have with the companies and the investors, which is going to make this a success. Or indeed, if this goes wrong, it's one of the main sort of failure risks that you have. And I think what I want companies to do, what I want investors to do, is to hold the strategic positive vision for the future, for the long term. And for all of us, that's going to mean perhaps giving up some short-term commercial gain, or indeed, from my perspective, being too short-termist about customer needs, for example. But if we all hold that together and we all make sure we work closely on the issues that we're facing, and we have a principle of honesty more than anything else, I think we can make huge progress. I do look at other regulatory regimes, and where that trust is broken down, it becomes incredibly hard to make progress.
Do you liaise or talk closely with your colleagues elsewhere in Europe? Are you in?
We do, absolutely. So we spend a lot of time, as an organisation, we are in constant dialogue with Europe, particularly around things like interconnectors, but also more broadly about how we're all thinking about the transition that we're on. We have sort of private regulatory groups where we get together and we share both, what the challenge is and what are some of the things that we've done that make us successful. And there is a vibrant community out there, actually, of people who are thinking about this, not just across Europe, but also for example, in the USA. So we are well networked with our colleagues. And as I say, there's two dimensions. There's pragmatic things we need to work on. So where are we going to have interconnectors? Do they make sense for both countries, etc.? But there's a lot more we can share in terms of the amount of change that we're seeing, sort of transition we're trying to go through, and how we're approaching it differently. The remarkable thing for me is, I've worked previously in India. I've carried out work in the USA, as well as working with colleagues across Europe. And although we have phenomenally different systems, from state-run, state-backed energy systems through to liberalized markets like Texas, we're all facing very similar challenges. And actually, the things that emerge are quite consistent between us. And that's what we need to build on.
Bringing the discussion back to Ofgem and the relationship with government, I see that the UK government has launched its its first comprehensive review of Ofgem, yes. And the aim of that is maybe, if I'm interpreting correctly or not, is to make you stronger as a regulator. I don't know if that's a correct interpretation, but how vital are those extra powers if they're granted to you, Jonathan? So
we are. And I am a real enthusiast for the Ofgem review. Our mandate was set 25 years ago. Even in our name, we are regulators of gas and electricity markets. And the reason why I'm keen that we go through this process is really sort of, I'd say, four broad things. So first of all, in statute, what are we here for? So we have a primary customer duty in statute, and we have something like 12 or 13 have regard to duties. Now, I don't think that really is a coherent legislative basis for a regulator to be able to make the sorts of decisions we're going to make in the next 5 or 10 years. And I think there are some genuine debates Parliament needs to have for example, about our role in growth and economic growth and driving the economy, given the sort of conversations we're having with Treasury right now. So there's something there about, looking again at what we're for and making sure we're all consistent, coherent, and happy with the direction that the regulator needs to go in on a principled level. But there are some very practical changes in this market. So the thing I say to government is, look, imagine you're a consumer in 2030 or 2035. Where's your energy coming from now? Well, we hope it'll be coming from potentially solar panels, potentially your battery that's installed in your home, potentially from your car battery plugged in outside or plugged into the street, or indeed from all sorts of other sources like district heating and others, or from aggregators who are using all our equipment to try and optimize on our behalf. Now, if you start with that customer and where they get their energy from, Ofgem doesn't have a lot of power to protect customers in some of those areas. So you won't have a consumer-focused energy regulator unless you think about the sort of organisation we need to be to protect people across the board. And look, I have seen some very poor behaviours in, for example, the solar market that at the moment we have some powers to tackle, but I would like us to have a more comprehensive assessment of what we need going forward. And that might mean being a bit fluid about where our regulatory boundary sits. So as new services come on, rather than waiting for the government to kind of notice, consult and regulate and legislate, we could do something a bit more like the FCA does, where we identify on an ongoing basis where the boundaries of our industry are and where we think we need to extend our powers, accepting, look, we're trying to create innovation here. We're trying to get a market that works. We're not trying to kind of be overbearing, but we know that, trying to address customer issues retrospectively is usually worse for everyone, including the companies involved themselves. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two, out of the gas crisis, there are many, many risks that we have mitigated, including the financial risk we've already talked about. But I do think there are residual risks that at the moment we don't have the power to address. So I would like to make sure that somewhere in the system, doesn't have to be Ofgem, there are powers that allow people to say if there is significant customer harm, so real customer detriment, then we're able, and someone has benefited financially from that, then we're able to square that circle. So we're able to make sure that, yes, this sector is investable, but that all investors and all companies behave responsibly. And then third, I do think there is a debate about the role you want the regulator to play when the government is setting such a clear and strong strategic direction, like the 2030 plan. For those who know it, like the spatial energy plan coming in 2026, what role do you want us to play in that? And how do you want us to interact with a vision which will be quite definitive, for example, around the sort of transmission we need in the country? And that can vary from writing a bit more clear policy statements for us, or something that allows us to operate perhaps in a narrower space around assessing how you best and most cost effectively deliver the plan that's there. So there's a lot there.
But the government, one of the clear remits for Ofgem is to spur growth or to be part of that growth engine. And isn't that's easier said than done, though, surely? How do you see your role in facilitating that, Jonathan?
Basically, first and foremost is being able to get investment into the sector. So something I'm very proud of over the last 5 years is we have completely changed our stance in network investment. So now we accept the case for strategic investment, we accept the case for anticipatory investment, and we are building out at pace, as we described, to get to the 2030 goals that we have. Now, a few years ago, for example, when I was in it's on the networks part of the organisation, it would take 2 or 3 years to get one project through. So I say we now have 26 main projects, but 80 projects in total that we are trying to get through the system at pace. And I don't think in the world we're in today that finance is going to be the problem, or regulatory finance is going to be the problem. Problem is around delivery and planning. And our focus right now with the industry is not only on unlocking the money, it's on saying to the industry, for this money, you need to be on time and on budget, which, as we know in infrastructure in this country, is not always the case. So that's thing one. And then, there's a lot we can do with the retail market to make sure that we can improve the way that that's invested in. But the other side of the house is making this sector fit for business. We've seen a lot of new rules coming into the business market to make sure that small businesses, for example, are able to operate in it. And we want to make sure that factories, when they want to be built in Britain, can get connected to the grid quickly. So there's a lot we can do. Tough questions like how we address whole industrial costs need to be answered. But in my sense is you get the investment in the sector that you need and make this sector a support for the investability of the UK.
A final question, Jonathan, really, and that's on market trading arrangements. The big discussion has been on sort of regional, nodal versus a market price, a national price. I mean, could you sort of highlight the pros and cons of each, and what when is a decision likely on that front, Sir Jonathan?
Well, I mean, it's a big decision. I remember running electricity market reform 4 years ago, for almost 4 years to get contracts for difference and the capacity market up and running. So these are big decisions. They're for the Secretary of State rather than for Ofgem themselves. But in a sense, I think the thing we need to be clear about is that with the amount of change that's in this sector, the idea we leave this market as it is, I don't think is credible. The amount that you have to pay wind farms to get constrained off, the amount that we end up with a system that's inefficient if we do absolutely nothing, I think means that it is not economically credible for the British consumer to leave it as it is. I think you have two options broadly. Leave the national market in place and find different ways using charging, using the balancing mechanism, etc., to try and make the economics work as well as possible. So in effect, try and get demand to locate in Scotland where there'll be a lot of wind, and to find efficient ways to manage when demand is supply is in excess of demand in places like Scotland as well. Or you go to a system that's much more flexible and adaptable, that says, look, if there's a lot of wind generating in Scotland, then the price in Scotland falls and people can respond as they do. Now, we've had a robust debate within Ofgem. This is, for regulators, this is as kind of passionate as it gets. So, if everyone was ever going to come to blows in Ofgem, it'll be over zonal pricing or something else. And, we have come to the view that zonal pricing, we think, is the best way forward. It's not a unanimous view. There are people on my board, for example, who would say we might want to do things differently. But by and large, we think that is the best way to create a system that's adaptable. We also accept, by the way, that you are likely to need protections for the investment that's going in at pace to get to 2030, and you're likely to need to think about whether or not you need to even things up between regions and areas within the UK. But all my experience suggests that if you get those economic mechanisms right, like we did with CFDs, where we moved to auctioning, you get developers focusing on the thing that really matters, which is getting their costs down and getting their projects in on time. And also you get industrial customers thinking very differently. So we're going to see an AI boom in this country, in my mind. We are going to see a huge growth in data centers, partly because the whole world is going to see a growth in data centers, and partly because we have so much across the data world that is positive about Britain. So we want to see an AI boom. But if you have that, really you want your data centers, if that fits with the latency needs and everything else that they have, to be locating in those parts of the country where there's a lot of wind and taking advantage of that cheap power when it's available. I think something like zonal pricing gives the opportunity for that to happen. I look across at Texas, and what is fascinating, even though they have a very, very liberal market and quite locational, we are seeing a lot of all the industrial development from the kind of Biden sort of interventions going to Texas, because that market is delivering the best costs for customers like that. So I think there's a big synergy there. So as I say, big debate within Ofgem. It's not finalised, but on balance, we think it's the right thing to do.
It's also very political as well, as you're seeing.
Absolutely.
With the bidding zone review in Europe. I mean, that's been delayed again and over. I've been waiting for it for the last 10 years, I think. But
Well, I didn't answer your question about when they're going to decide.
No, exactly. But hopefully fairly soon. But Jonathan, thank you so much for your insights. Fascinating discussion, and best of luck for meeting the 2030 targets. They're certainly very ambitious, but I think, as you say, they are not impossible. So you've been listening to Plugged In, the Engine News podcast. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks very much.